being able to internalize what is your game plan. You know that you've done the work. You know that you're technically and tactically proficient in what you need to do. So how do you remove the white noise and pursue the signal of your mindfulness of being present in the moment? MMA is 90% mental apart from the 60% that's physical.
Dr. Duncan French, welcome to the show.
Hi, mate. How are you doing? Good to hear from you.
I know, it's nice to hear a familiar Northeastern voice while we're over in the States.
I know, right? It's there's nothing like home when it comes down to it. It's
Harrogate for you, right?
Originally North Yorkshire, yeah, Harrogate, Knaresborough region, and then moved to Newcastle for college, and I kind of call Newcastle home now.
Wow.
I'm an adopted Geordie, let's say.
Okay, yeah. Well, the number of times that I get accused of being Australian while I'm over here, I was at a big meetup yesterday, and I got accused of being Australian more times than I got accused of being British. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not.
Oh, mate, I'm in my fifth year, well, 4 years for my PhD, and then now 5 years since I came back to the States. I get everything from South African to Australian to New Zealand to Arkansas, you name it.
Wow. So you've been working with, is it over 30 professional or Olympic sports since you started?
Yeah, I think 37, was the last time I counted. So yeah, been blessed. It's been good. Lots of variety and lots of opportunity. But yeah, whether it's pro sport or the Olympic movement, I've been around the block, let's say.
And it was 3 full Olympic cycles with Team GB as well.
Yeah, through the English Institute of Sport, which is obviously the high performance service provider to British Olympic programs. As well as Commonwealth programs like netball and things like that. But I was a strength and conditioning coach and sports scientist through the English Institute for about 14 years. So as you say, a variety of different sporting backgrounds. So it's been cool ride right to now.
What's the common thread between all of those? Have you moved into specialities since you've been there? Was it always strength and conditioning? Was it performance?
Yeah, no, I've always been a strength and conditioning physical preparation coach. That's kind of what I would call my primary area of expertise. With some sports science weaved into there. I my degrees and things, PhDs are in sports science, but I certainly went around the coaching route, and then could call upon my strength and conditioning and my sports science throughout that. So it's let's say, many hats, many strings to the bow when you need it. That's kind of part of the deal.
So given the fact that you've had over 30 sports that you've worked with and then you've stepped into the UFC, what is particularly unique about the athletes that you work with there? You've got this broad base of experience in the past, but now you're working with a very broad-ranging sport. What's different about the guys that you work with, their preparation, their training?
Listen, every sport's got its own culture, and things that you really resonate to, and things that you're like, whoa, why are they doing it like that? And you kind of question some of the behaviors. But I think I'm not bold enough to say the success is because of me. It's hopefully I play, or the teams that I'm involved with play a role in that. Athletes are successful before the service providers come online, and they'll be successful long after we're gone. I think, when you look at all the different sports, they all come with different cultural approaches and different kind of dogmatic mindsets in what is good and what is bad. I'm blessed right now to work with combat athletes and obviously MMA fighters here in the UFC. And I think this is the one sport in all of my career where the challenges and the different variables that go into success are so complex. This community, this group of athletes are, they want to win, and you can harness that motivation and that energy. And I think that's one thing which really differentiates combat athletes is just the commitment to the grind. Any elite athlete at the highest level is doing things that are different to the normal Joe Blow walking down the street, right? But I think when you look at the rigors of what MMA is and what these guys go through on a day-to-day basis, it truly has a lot to behold. And I think that's what's fascinating about this community. They are spitting sawdust and pretty honest as the day is long, but they are, their commitment and their dedication to their craft and their ethic is unfoundering. It's amazing.
Would you say that the MMA fighters are about as ultimate of an athlete as you're going to get at the moment coming out of sport?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm biased, right? Because I sit in this space right now. But again, you look at gymnasts or divers, and the skill and the artistry is amazing. You can take any sport and you can pull things from it. But just in terms of true athleticism and what an MMA fighter has to do by combining strength, power, conditioning, skill, the psychological component of being able to execute under what is truly severe and consequential outcomes. Really differentiates them, and it's funny because I get a lot of other athletes or athletes that I've worked with formerly reaching out to me and say, big fan of the UFC, or I think that's kind of a measure when you have other pro athletes saying, like, I love watching MMA and the UFC, and those guys are unreal what they can do. And okay, well, if you're saying that, then there's obviously something in it, which is pretty cool to hear.
Yeah, it's such an entertaining sport. The guys have really, really got this format right, which is. It's two guys or two girls in a 8-sided ring smashing 7 shades of shit out of each other for a while, and then someone's hand gets raised at the end of it. It's a fairly simple format, but it is so accessible, super entertaining. I think the build-up that they've got now, at first I wasn't much of a fan of the cleaning up of the branding, but I think that also makes everything look a lot more cleaner and professional, which is great. Going back to what you said before about the fact that there has been an influence of your input, the Performance Institute, on the outcomes that you're getting from the fighters, but because you are dealing with every fighter, the waterline of all of them gets raised up, right? Like, everybody has access to you guys. Now, not everybody's going to get the same sort of outcomes because not everybody's as coachable, not everybody responds as well. They might have more dogmatic ideologies within their own gym and such like, but how are you gauging the impact that you have across the board, across all fighters, when everybody has access? It's not like the UFC beat some other organization in a big battle royale.
It's a little bit different to any professional sporting organization where you're judged on wins and losses for all intents and purposes, right? We're kind of the league, let's say, and we'll only ever bat 500 because we might be working with both athletes that are in the octagon at the same time for a main event.
But you've never lost a fight.
Right, we've never lost a fight. We've also won a lot as well, right? Lost a lot, excuse me. I mean, I think our evaluation of our success is based on different kind of KPIs and objectives. It comes down to what you said at the head of your question. Yes, the Performance Institute is about raising the level across the whole fight community globally. That's a big ambition, right? But it's about slowly evolving the sport to embed, better training science, better methodologies, better approaches for medicine or nutrition or whatever it may be. The nature of injuries and the incidence of injuries and how they're happening around a wrestling practice that might have too many athletes on the mat at one time, and a wrestling scramble, and someone might roll onto another pair working somewhere else on the mat, and you cause a stupid injury that's completely preventable. Those type of things we kind of try and keep an eye on, looking at how athletes are making weight and the status of their weight making exercises, and is it done in an optimized fashion. Ultimately we're in a weight classification sport, which in itself is a cultural approach. Not every sport requires you to make weight. That brings with it a lot of nuance and a lot of tradition and approaches. So how do we kind of get the athletes into the octagon in the most optimal way possible, around the parameters of making weight and the guys having to cut weight? And then other things like, some of the performance metrics, like, is the show entertaining? The technical skills that have been executed. We take a lot of interest in that as well, because ultimately by association, whilst we're not necessarily the ones coaching those techniques or the technical tactical side of it, giving people physical attributes or a mental status to go and try a technique in competition, or, as I say, optimizing someone's capability during competition, you would say that the probability of the fight being at a higher level, at a higher standard, is also got some influence by the work that we're doing as well.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting is if you look back to the traditions of fighting, your Bruce Lee's, the very much a sort of savant artistic interpretation. You had more Eastern martial arts that would involve things like energy, chi, such like. How are you finding the blend? Because I'm presuming you can't have completely got rid. And there's also, the sort of fighters that are very much flow and natural and artistic in the way that they fight. How are you finding the blend between this artistic element and the data-driven in interventions that you need to make with people?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think first and foremost, it's martial arts, right? It's mixed martial arts, and whilst it's a competitive fight, and that's chaos often. You'd be surprised the underpinning techniques and tactics that go into the fight at any moment in time. And again, I draw on something that's been brought into our ecosystem here at the Performance Institute through our head MMA coach over at our Shanghai Academy, Dean Singer. He talks about the MFA, which is the martial artists. So the martial artists, they are fighters. And then there are also athletes. All right, so FMA, like we look at that kind of trifecta of influence. So when it comes to the artistry, the tactics, the technical skill set, a lot of our guys still draw on Bruce Lee and some of those pure martial art skill sets. And then, athleticism, we can put a lot of data and objectivity around athleticism. So whether it is martial arts, being a fighter, which is more mental and some physical attributes, but then also the physical attributes of athleticism and being an athlete, we can start to really nail down each of these three factors that go into, driving success in our sport.
Talking about some of the tensions that might be going on between the way that people typically see fighters, particularly those that do MMA, and the new world or this sort of renaissance that you guys are getting with data-driven interventions and stuff and trying to professionalize all of this. How are you finding managing the relationship between your team and the guys that you look after and the interventions that they want, and then the athletes, the fighters' coach, and the gym that they go back to, or the multiple gyms that they might go back to afterwards? They're going to have their ideas around how they should be preparing, how they should be training, their loading, etc., etc. Talk to me about the tension between those.
Yeah, I think you talk about tension. I think you got to try and remove the tension, and that's any sport, right? And again, I draw on my experiences, and it doesn't matter what sport you go into. It comes down to the maturity of people to handle data and handle information. Now, for some sports that have got legacy and long-term history of using wearable technology or handling data, looking at statistics and measuring up. You take a sport like basketball, everything's built, or American football, everything's built around statistics. Baseball is probably the most classic one there. So they're really comfortable in using and talking about numbers and using numbers to direct strategy. Other sports might not necessarily be as mature in handling data and be comfortable with that type of information. Mixed martial arts being one of them. So what we're trying to do is obviously elevate people's awareness and understanding of the types of information we're giving them. You can look to the recent kind of evolution of leg kicks or low calf kicks in MMA and how it's kind of revolutionizing our sport as something that's really pivoted the sport and taking it down a different direction. I mean, calf kicks have always been around, but they've not been used as much as they are now, and they're truly debilitating, right? So it's becoming a real an offensive tactic, but you've also got to be defending against that. So, out there in the community, the coaches are innovating at any moment in time, but what we're trying to do is kind of put evidence and evaluation against it to say, how can we optimize it further? How can we give you competitive advantage and try and come together and meet the rubber where it meets the road with the maturity of an athlete or a coach to handle information.
Yeah. How do you deal with the fact that typically you have a strength and conditioning or a coaching unit that is looking after one team and every athlete that works underneath them is being pushed forward, whereas you are doing fighter and opponent? Now, obviously, There'll be securities around data and such like. It's not like you're going to be telling each fighter what the other one's preparing and stuff like that. But that must be a very unique environment to work in, right? Where you are, like we said before, you win and lose every single fight that you've been involved in.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we're agnostic to the whole roster. So you're absolutely right. Athlete, the model that we work to is that the UFC fighters are independent contractors. So we can't mandate that they engage with the Performance Institute and the services that we offer. It's very much an a la carte, take it or leave it, pick what you want type approach. And obviously that drives individuality from the very get-go. Some athletes want all of our service provision. Some athletes want nothing to do with us because there's a lot of paranoia about what you're talking about in this question. Other athletes will pick and choose bits and pieces as and when they see fit. If you've got some kind of injury or historical injury that we're working and treating with you, obviously your opponent doesn't, that information is sacrosanct. If your opponent was to find that out, that could truly change the likelihood of your success in the event. So yeah, we're very sensitive to how we handle information, how we handle data, knowing that we've got this really kind of wild and unique business model that we work to, where we're potentially working with two fighters that are going to compete in a month's time, and we're strategizing and working with their coaches, helping them on physical development, etc., etc. I think the thing that we do to distance ourselves completely for that is that we don't coach and teach technical and tactical work through the Performance Institute, which is obviously the secret sauce. The MMA techniques. What we do is obviously support them with nutrition and body composition, with diagnostics, with physical preparation, with mental preparation, all those supplementary factors, not necessarily the true things which are going to influence the outcome of the fight, which is technical tactical work. So we kind of align ourselves to that, but we don't deliver that specifically.
What are the primary metrics that you're looking at over the weeks and months? So my housemate has just been given a promotion at Newcastle Falcons. He's now the junior physio of the first team. And since living with him for the last few years, I've been fascinated learning about chronic load and yardage. And I got to see the back end of one of the spreadsheets that they have these readouts. And it's just an endless stream of data. Who got up to the maximum velocity this week? Who's done the most yardage? All this stuff. So what's the equivalent in your world? What do you look at from the players?
Yeah, I mean, welcome to the world of world-class or elite level sport right now. I mean, there's more data than we all know what to do with, because ultimately technology has changed the game. And as soon as you start wearing technology in competition and training, and you're aggregating all this information, I mean, just kind of processing that in a team setting can be overwhelming. But I think when we look at MMA, obviously we're trying to get to the same questions. We're trying to understand how you optimize training load, the exposure to a training stimulus to maximize the effect of that training stimulus. So how do we do that? How do we measure people's exposure? And what's the right exposure? It's the Goldilocks effect, right? How much is too much? How much is too little? And Goldilocks, that's just right. Exactly, that's what we need to be. There's a lot of research and literature out there that we know connection between the likelihood of injury or an injury incidence with overtraining versus undertraining versus where things sit. So that's an important conversation. But in the sport of MMA, it's a little bit different, right? Because we don't have really robust data insights around competition. Our fighters, it's not like they're wearing heart rate monitors. It's not like they're wearing GPS. It's not like they're wearing any kind of accelerometers or those types of things where we can really start to understand what competition is. We're kind of extrapolating a little bit and making insinuations based on the data we can get in sparring or in training. So yeah, we look at training load, we look at vision assessments and reaction times, we look at cognitive function. Obviously it's a sport where you're getting hit in the head. So how do we monitor and manage those exposure loads, whether it's through instrumented mouthpieces that have accelerometers in them where we can look at head impacts.
No way, you can put something in the mouth that's going to measure everything.
Oh yeah, that's kind of the direction we're going now.
That's wild.
That's kind of already. Yeah, in rugby and Australian rules football, it's already happening a little bit. We're pursuing that with MMA, and then you've obviously got other factors like just your strength, power, characteristics, heart rate for your conditioning. What's your training zone? What's your biological load with respect to lactate management, things like that. So, I mean, listen, to answer the question, it's a lot of different things. But in the sport of MMA, we still really haven't nailed down what competition truly is, so that we can reverse engineer everything from competition. So that's the North Star for us right now, is working with different partners and technology and academics to say, all right, how can we really nail down an understanding of what MMA is? because we haven't got those insights. And obviously there's the striking components, but there's grappling components where you're not really moving too much, but there's a huge metabolic demand through isometric hold or isometric contraction that it's really hard to classify what that looks like in terms of ultimately the athletic load that you have to, form in the octagon.
I went to this meetup that I said yesterday where I got accused of being an Australian. And at it, I met this guy who spends 8 hours a day in virtual reality. So he's at the forefront of like developing apps and games. Yeah, he seemed to love it. But and he was telling me that there is new VR technology that is able to track the body's position in space so that it can accurately represent it in the virtual reality world. I'm wondering whether you would be able to get to the stage in future where all of the different camera angles that you guys have around the octagon may be able to track stuff like trauma and movement, and then be able to reverse engineer that to actually be able to give you some sort of metrics. But the fact that you've got a GPS mouth guard with an inbuilt HRV monitor or a heart rate sensor in it, that blows my mind. You could have something that you just knock into your mouth and it give you all of those solutions. Is crazy.
Yeah, it's cool, right? And again, that's one piece of equipment and technology that they wear in training and competition. So, that's something that we're pursuing because it can be universal then. But yeah, I mean, you talk about VR, like anything that mitigates, TBI or concussion or the risk of head trauma in our sport is going to be beneficial and advantageous. So we're actively pursuing those types of things. And yeah, VR, virtual reality, augmented reality in a combat environment, along with haptic technology where you look at vibration. So, it's coming out of the gaming world, World of Warcraft or whatever, or COD, those types of things where you shoot your gun, but you're getting that feedback as well at the same time. How can we apply haptic technology in a augmented reality space where we're using VR and we're also getting haptic feedback to say you're suggesting you're getting hit or a punch or something, but you're actually not. Those are the types of training strategies kind of moving into the future that we're also exploring.
Dude, this is year 3000 shit. It's so right. Advanced. Did I hear you once mention that you guys were looking at some of the potential impacts of psychedelics as a performance enhancer?
Not as a performance enhancer, but around traumatic brain injury.
So like as a neuroprotective type thing.
Correct, yeah, and there's been some good work, particularly out of Johns Hopkins University over in Maryland, where they're looking at terminal illness patients and patients with certain medical conditions that are going to be terminal at some point. So how do they use psychedelics to relieve pain or remove, and again, in kind of combat populations where they looked at post-traumatic stress disorders and depression and some of these aspects on a very clinical level, how psychedelics have potentially an opportunity to influence that. Again, it's very early days for the UFC. It's not something that we're completely, running down this avenue right now. But again, looking at working with partners to cover every avenue to see where, yes, we know that we operate in a combat sport, right? There are certain issues and factors related to combat sport within the parameters of the rules of the sport, where yes, it's a collision and it's a contact sport. It's going to lead to certain physical, psychological, social, emotional impacts that might have a detrimental effect. So whether it's a rule change, whether it's equipment that you wear, whether it's interventions like psychedelics or like nutritional interventions or neurotropics or whatever it may be, I think we're just very engaged in trying to understand that and take them on so that we can do a better job of keeping our athletes in the most safe and healthy space possible.
How much do you deal with the psychological strain? So I'm fascinated by the fact that you're asking your athletes, and this is the same with every fight sport. I mean, it's the same with every sport in general, but particularly with a fight sport where there's so much glory around success. There's so much, not shame around defeat, but you can see it in the player's body language or the fighter's body language right at the end of the fight. Plus, there is fight week leading up to it. There's press conferences. There's shit talking beforehand. There's weight cuts. It's such a unique blend of psychological strain, which is precisely designed, at least by your opponent, that way, right? To put you in a place where you're not actually all that confident. how much have you looked at strategies for how the guys can deal with this? And are there any lessons that people could take away into their own lives in the build up to a stressful situation or something that they're perhaps a little bit anxious about?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, listen, we're a promotion, right? And these guys are independent contractors, so they're in the business of promoting themselves to get people to buy tickets to come and watch them. So whether it's shit talking or whether it's promotion, like they're trying to sell the event and get people interested in their fight. Without letting you behind the curtain too much, some of that's obviously real, some of it's bravado, but again, it makes for an interesting build up to the fight itself. I mean, from a psychological or sports psychology perspective, we're absolutely getting into that space because it's a pillar of performance. So how do athletes manage that? How do they use it to their advantage? How do they stay away from someone else doing it? And I think when we first started the Performance Institute back in 2017, we didn't have sports psychology as part of our portfolio of services. It's absolutely a critical core component now, and we offer that to the athletes. But yeah, I think to answer it succinctly, we do a lot of work around kind of mindfulness and being able to disassociate from all that white noise and being able to internalize what is your game plan. You know that you've done the work. You know that you're technically and tactically proficient in what you need to do. So how do you remove the white noise and pursue the signal of your mindfulness of being present in the moment? Now, present in the moment in the UFC can be someone kind of 7 seconds from choking you out. So, you've still got to be mindful and present in that moment. But again, it comes down to, right, what's the technique? What's the tactic I need to actually execute to remove this choke? There's so many pieces of white noise and chaos and so many factors. And I think, to succinctly give you an answer, when we look at our psychologists and the work that they do with our athletes, it's very much around being present and being mindful and being able to process things effectively. Otherwise, those external signals just overwhelm.
Yeah. It's strange to think about the number of parameters that go into someone putting a good performance on in UFC. Like, it's so unbelievably intense to balance all of these different elements. And something that I've always thought about is the number of athletes out there in any domain who physiologically may have the characteristics to make them an unbelievably elite athlete. They may have the approach to training, they may have the genetics, they may have the work rate, the conscientiousness, the industriousness, the support system, everything. However, they are unable to deal with the stress of game day. And I wonder how many athletes throughout the years have got themselves to the stage where they could have been a world champ, they could have been the greatest that ever lived, and they were let down by their inability to kind of get out of their own head and allow themselves to perform on game day.
Yeah, and the stakes are pretty high in this sport. This is, like I say, it's a sport of consequences, right? And every sport has got consequences, but in this sport, they can be pretty severe, right? So that just layers on kind of the pressures and the stresses. And we jest here at the PI, but we say, the MMA is 90% mental, apart from the 60% that's physical. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just everything. You need everything in this sport. And again, coming back to one of your early questions, like, it's really hard to, there's so many variables, right? So it's really hard to say one is any more important than the other. But when it comes to mental fortitude, and that's even before you get into competition, like the mental fortitude just to get through the rigors of training on a daily basis, to hit the mitts and then do your strength and conditioning work on the side, like just a mental fortitude to be compliant and adhere to a long-term approach to technical and tactical development as well as physical development. That alone is challenging in our sport. Now, you can liken that to things like rowing or rugby codes or whatever it may be, which are also very physical. But then, you layer on that psychological piece of you walking into competition and there's millions watching on TV and you're potentially going to get knocked out and people are going to ridicule you and laugh at you whilst you're laying
memes about you on
back.
Twitter.
Right. Which is shocking. These underpants internet warriors. It's easy to point fingers. So that's where I come back to, like, our athletes are up there with the best of them when it comes to their ability to deal with all the variables that go into success. It's pretty, it's truly a decathlon of combat sport, and it's pretty crazy.
Have you worked with rowing?
I have, yeah, a lot.
Well, one of the things that I think about there is I've done 2K row time tests before, and the state of arousal that I get myself, or fear, basically, that I get myself into before having to do that. What were some of the lessons that you got out of the time that you worked with rowers? Because, there's some of the events that they do, which are, and some of the training sessions that I've done. I always find the Oxford, Cambridge rowing event, the lead up to that, where they go through the training montages and they explain what everyone's going through. It looks up there with some of the most brutal training protocols that I've ever seen. Is that what it's actually like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, rowing can be, the physical demands of elite level rowing, and the physical and physiological adaptations that you're trying to make to your body in training are massive, right? So yeah, those guys push themselves to the absolute limit, and I've been around some of those sessions, and it's just terrifying and brutal to watch. Someone's not kind of stomping on your head then, or someone's not kind of come and trying to truly knock you out. Like I say, and I'm not playing down kind of rowing or anything, or any other sport. I'm just saying, I think when you look at all the respective factors and the outcome of our sport, what people are trying to do to you and inflict physical damage to you as well, it just makes it just layers on another kind of level of intensity. And I'm not using that as a physical intensity, just like intensity of everything. Because rowing is, the training for rowing to be an elite level rower is brutal. But yeah, these guys are doing it, and they've got the psychological piece.
It's a 2K row test with someone trying to punch you in the face while you do it.
Yeah. Just constantly.
I have so I met a couple of guys who were recently on a reality TV program for an upcoming grappling competition that was going on, and it was kind of like an Ultimate Fighter style thing. So living in a fight house, and they were going out and doing their whatever, and they were playing pranks on each other in between and stuff like that. And they had, in order to get through to one of the next rounds, they had a no time limit grappling event, which I had never heard of before, but isn't unbelievably rare apparently in that world. And one of the fights that the dude that was traveling to this event in San Antonio with us had lasted for 3 hours and 55 minutes of grappling. Yeah. 3 hours and 55 minutes of grappling.
Think about that. Think about that. I mean, just processing that is ridiculous, right? You're essentially, grappling and trying to, submit or choke out an opponent the same duration it takes someone to run a marathon. Do you know what I mean? It's just almost unfathomable. But that's what these guys will do, and the warrior spirit will take them through that.
Dude, it's unbelievable. I was really, really impressed, but it's one of those things where you realize just how big of a delta there is between. Everybody sits on the sidelines and talks about like, oh well, it'd be he should slip that punch and he should do this in a different way, because everybody feels like they have some sort of 5 pence to add into the discussion around things. You realize it's a different universe. These people they're completely different animals. So speaking of that, are there some fighters that you've worked with or that you've seen in the Performance Institute, either sort of current roster or previous roster, that are just a total joy to coach, or people that have come in with a very particular physiology that you found that's unique or different or impressive that you hadn't seen previously?
I mean, I'll answer your question. Yes, it's funny, right? Because I've worked with all these different sports, but there's one thing which the armchair expert always knows, and that's fighting and nutrition, right? And here we are. I'm working in a sport where and the same thing. Everyone seems to be an expert in how you win a fight. You know what I mean? So it's like there's a lot of noise and a lot of opinion in this world. You cut through that. I think, like I said, I come back to the clientele, the athlete population. Like in my experience, whilst there's different polarizing characters in our sport, talking generically, like this is a group of athletes that I just love working with. That are like they want to get after it. They want to do the work. They're not scared of the work. They are committed to the cause and to the arts and all that type of stuff. And I mean, absolute pleasure to work with. Of course, I've got quirks and traits. And like, come on, mate, what the fuck are you doing? That, like, why are you doing that? But I mean, at the end of the day, as a group of athletes, I would work with combat athletes any day of the week. When I've looked at some of my other athletes, and again, whether it's, Premier League soccer or, where athletes position in the pecking order and the hierarchy of things, but combat athletes are absolute joy and pleasure to work with, certainly on the physical preparation side, because you're not having to convince them to do the work usually. You're pulling the horses back and saying, hold on, like, enough is enough. Like, let's just think about this strategically. So, yeah, I mean, I don't want to mention any particular names, but there's lots of individuals on our roster who like absolute warriors, true first-class people, whether they've come from Olympic backgrounds through freestyle wrestling in the Olympic Games, or whether they come through collegiate programs, or whether they're talent transfers from football, like American football, or whether they're just guys that have been on the fight circuit and journeymen that have been knocking people out, for year over year, and just like, okay, this is a guy that might not be the best athlete, but is just a hard individual and a hard human being. And it's just, even those guys, like, great to be around, because you can learn so much from their mindset and their mentality of how they approach life, right? It's fascinating.
So going into some of the training protocols and stuff that you use that people at home may be able to take on, I know that you've done a lot of research around optimal reps, set ranges, rest periods in order to maximize muscle growth and hypertrophy. What sort of conclusion have you come to at the moment with that?
Yeah, I mean, the irony is that we don't pursue a lot of hypertrophy training techniques in combat athletes, because usually they're having to make weight. So, we're not trying to put excessive amounts of muscle on an athlete. In the rare chance we do, if someone moves up a weight class, or if someone's kind of still, chronically underfueled or whatever it may be, we try and pursue some of those types of things. But yeah, I mean, I think the key things to hypertrophy obviously, looking at muscle damage, how you ensue muscle damage, are kind of the three pillars of hypertrophy. So using different training approaches, whether it be cluster sets, whether it be drop sets, whether it be pause reps, whether it be eccentrics, accentuated eccentrics, whatever, there's a different way to do that. So there's no like perfect method for creating hypertrophy. But, looking at time under tension is a volume conversation. It's how much tension can you put through a muscle within a working set. So, larger rep ranges and set ranges, obviously, or the number of times within a week. So kind of looking at, 12 to 30 sets for a given muscle group in a training week is where you're trying to pursue hypertrophy. Looking at how you damage tissue, because then it can regrow and redevelop to a greater level, so rebuild larger. So how do you use techniques like eccentrics that are going to promote some tissue damage to allow it to then regenerate and recover?
When you say eccentrics, are you talking about tempo movements basically there?
Correct. Yeah. Slow eccentric, so concentric shortening actions versus eccentric lengthening actions, which we know damage the muscle more. And then also creating a metabolic stimulus, like what's the internal environment, whether it's nitric oxide that you're trying to release, and that's where some of this, blood flow restriction is now quite vogue in hypertrophy training. That's just trying to create a metabolic stress inside the cell. And then obviously the critical thing in parallel to those three factors is nutrition, is protein and protein synthesis, and looking at the protein synthetic rate of muscle, how muscle can turn over protein, and are you fueling your body? Excuse me, wrong term. Are you providing kind of the building blocks? And usually that is, leucine is the key amino acid for muscle growth and muscle hypertrophy that we need to think about. But are you kind of putting your nutrition strategy in a very complementary fashion with the training strategy and a training stimulus that is going to affect those three factors? Yeah.
What are the big mistakes that people are making when it comes to that sort of peri-training nutrition strategy?
Well, I think a lot of the science, a lot of research obviously is around nutrient timing. And, I think particularly around a training session, you need to get the protein in as close to the cessation of the end of your workout as possible, all right? Because that's when the protein synthetic rate is going to be at its highest, and the resynthesis of protein and the rebuilding of the amino acids is going to be at its highest level. So providing those building blocks through a nutrition intervention is going to be critical. If you leave it too long, obviously you're just negating or mitigating the extent of protein synthesis that's going to happen. So that's kind of the key thing. And yeah, anywhere between kind of 0.25 to 0.3 of a gram per kilo of body weight per day is what you're looking at from a protein stimulus or a protein intake for hypertrophy strategies.
0.25 to 0.3 of a gram per kilo of body weight post. What is that? Just around the workout
per day?
Yeah, I'm trying to work out because surely that would be whatever 40 grams or 30 grams of protein per day.
Correct.
But that's not total intake.
No, not total intake.
Yes.
In terms of supplementary protein.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It's so funny that there was that sort of back in the day, the bro science around where you need to get your post-workout shake in as quickly after a training session as possible. And then again, you're talking to people that get their information from bodybuilding.com forums, right? And like meme pages from Reddit and stuff like that. But that was something that was, I think about 5 years ago, very widely dispelled as if it fits your macros, it doesn't really matter. Calories are calories. And then when we actually go and speak to somebody that's at the cutting edge of elite sport, it turns out that, well, maybe the bros in the beginning were right all along.
Evidence-based research and research-based evidence, right? And I think a lot of sports techniques and sports training have been built on anecdotal insights and people trying out techniques, and then the science has followed and put efficacy against some of those original methods. And clearly, it's also made other approaches and other methods less than efficacious, and they've been kind of phased out. So what's leading the narrative, the science or the practice, is always the question.
Talking about something that I never ever considered during training, because it felt like something that was too complex and too sort of forward thinking, about the hormone release effect that you get from different types of training stimulus. And let's say that it's for somebody that's just trying to keep themselves fit and look good and, be healthy and maybe gain a little bit of muscle and keep themselves at whatever body fat level, or perhaps even try and recomp a little bit. I'd never considered the impact of different training methodologies on the hormone profile that's going on in my body. And you hear about the fact that you get growth hormone release from heavy compound movements and you get testosterone release from such and such. What is, for the normal layperson that's just looking to train, what are the things that they should consider when it comes to optimizing hormone release through their training methodology?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to understand this metabolic stimulus, right? As we've talked about time under tension, we've talked about muscle damage, and then obviously the metabolic stimulus, the metabolic environment that's created within the muscle. So, this is what my PhD work was around. So, this is where kind of some of my messaging has come from in this space. But yeah, again, it comes back to how you stimulate intensities of or volumes of workload to create that metabolic stimulus, of which a endocrine cascade is part of the equation. It's not the whole equation, obviously.
What do you mean when you say endocrine cascade?
Well, just the release of hormones consequent to muscle stimulus or a metabolic mode. So how do the hormones get to certain types of stimulus? You do a training program that is 5 sets of 2 with 3 minutes in between each set. It's going to be a very different metabolic stimulus to 4 sets of 12 with 60 seconds rest between, right? So that's the challenge of training and training strategies, understanding what is it of those 3 factors that you're trying to stimulate. I think metabolic stimulus and hormone responses is a part of that conversation. So when you're trying to maximize hypertrophy and you're trying to maximize those 3 particular factors, then potentially there's some legs to considering what you do to stimulate hormone release as well. So
you're looking at intensity as one of the key factors for this?
Yes, intensity and volume. Yeah, intensity and volume. Because again, if you look at training intensity and how hard you're pushing a muscle or the contractual units of the muscle, that's going to have a certain stimulus. You can play on those 2 factors by creating training strategies by the be different workouts within a given week or within a specific workout where you're targeting those two things at the same time. Again, the end point is that you're trying to stimulate a stress response that might have or will have kind of some beneficial effects to promote muscle growth within the cell.
I've heard you say, is it 6 sets of 10 at 80% with a couple of minutes rest in between as one of the protocols that you use?
Yeah, I mean, that was very much from my PhD research. Yeah, 6 sets of 10 with a minute's rest in between.
1 minute's rest.
90 seconds in between, 90 seconds in between, but do that as drop sets. So you're always trying to retain you start at a load of 80% of your 1RM, but the key thing is to hit the 10 repetition requirement of each set. So you essentially can do a drop set, so that you can take the load. You might not be able to complete the set of 10. You rack it, you immediately unload, and you finish off the remaining repetitions to complete your 10 sets. So yeah, it's a pretty challenging and brutal approach to a training stimulus.
It's fucking absolutely possessed. Like it does. I can't think of a more disgusting training protocol. Because what I hadn't heard the first time that I heard you say that, I hadn't heard about the stripping of weights, either like intraset or across sets. So I'm thinking, who can do 6 by 10 at 80%? Who can do 10? Who can do 1 by 10 at 80%? Especially with the short rest.
Normally you get two sets out at 80% or so, but then into the potentially second or third or beyond sets, you're really starting to strip the bar back, because then again, like I say, that's now becomes the volume conversation. It's about using the drop sets of the load to complete the required volume.
Am I guessing that if you were to do an RPE, you'd be looking at like an RPE 9.5 by the end of each set?
I mean, yeah,
because it can't be a 10, or else you're not going to have made. Oh, well, I guess it would be a 10, but you're not going to have gone above a 10, because otherwise you wouldn't have made the repetitions, right?
I mean, a 10 on an RPA scale is maximal, right? So you would want maximum, because if you only do 4 repetitions, you unload, you might get another 2 repetitions out, you unload again, you might get another 3 repetitions. Like, that's how you work in the stimulus, right? So it's always trying to be maximal in nature.
Okay, and with this, did you find that certain exercises engendered themselves to better hormone release? I'm going to guess larger movements, more muscle groups being recruited. What were the best exercises?
I think that's the secret to all like hypertrophy type approaches is large compound exercises and more muscle activation.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, well, I might see if some of the lads in the gym fancy doing it tomorrow, but they're going to take a little bit of I'll get them to listen to this first, and I'll tell them about your credentials, and we'll see what they can say. Talking about recovery between sessions, and especially with your guys, right? Because you've got so many different domains that the fighters need to be able to move through. It's not just technique stuff. It's not just strength and conditioning. It's not just the cardio. All of these different bits and pieces. What have you found is an upper bound that you can get? Say the average elite fighter, I'm aware that person doesn't particularly exist. What's the upper bound in terms of a training volume, duration per day that you can get people through?
I mean, I'll answer that a little bit differently. I mean, we recommend kind of anywhere between 10 and 14 training units a week. But there's guys that are absolutely doing upwards of 18 to 20 training units a week. There's a conversation around quality, right? It's a quality and quantity conversation. Some sessions, are going to be 60 to 90 minutes long, but there's also fighters that'll pull 3-hour long training sessions and don't think twice about it. So it's that's where we don't have the answers right now. We don't understand kind of what is the true optimal level, what's the true, the true standard approach that we put in place. And we're still trying to figure that out through kind of monitoring and evaluating training kind of loads and people's ability to tolerate that.
I've got a bunch of friends who are chasing for a CrossFit Games or a CrossFit Regionals spot at the moment, and I think that there are some similarities probably between your guys' sports, just that they're very wide in terms of the different domains and the different stimuluses that you're trying to get out of all of the different training protocols that people do. And there, I'll say, hey man, send me, because I just like to be a sort of a voyeuristic torturer, and I'll say, but send me what your training week looks like. And you see it's up at 7 a.m. for hour and a half swim. It's back. I'll have a nap until the morning time. I'll do some strength work and maybe some monostructural work. Then I'll go back, have some more food. Then I'll go in. You're thinking like this is, multiple days per week. And their active recovery days look like just a slightly lower intensity version of a longer workout that I might try and do. And
if you think of something like CrossFit, which has got potentially many different components to it, whether you're working on your strength or your Olympic lifts, or whether you're working on handstand walks, or swimming, now bringing swimming into the CrossFit Games, so you don't know what's going to happen in the CrossFit Games, right? So you're always preparing for the unknown by just ticking every single box. That's the same as MMA. You've got lots of different variables that you need to kind of complete the training exposure in. So how do you distribute that? You're either stacking sessions on top of each other and making very long sessions and then having more prolonged, rest periods, or you're doing, distributing of training blocks throughout the day in a very sporadic nature to try and capture some recovery after each workout. We don't really have that figured out in its entirety right now. A lot
of that down to personal preference at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, the personal lifestyles of the fighter. Are they night owl?
You've got to pick the kids up from school, right, or something like that, yeah. Some
fighters have full-time jobs as pipe layers or electricians or whatever, as well as doing all the training. Demetrius Johnson, who was obviously 125 in the UFC for a long time, now fights in a different organization, but he holds the records for the most defenses in 125. He was a full-time contractor, builder, and worked on a building site whilst at the same time doing his MMA training. So
what would you say if you were to try and characterize some of the attributes between the guys that joined the UFC, who are, obviously elite fighters, they've managed to get themselves an invite into the organization, and the difference between the ones that come and go and are unable to have that longevity and unable to really make it to the absolute elite of the sport and become not necessarily champions, because that's beyond just their own internal training and approach to the sport, but between those guys and between the guys that do make it to the absolute top and then also have the longevity as well in terms of characteristics, their approach to whatever it be, maybe training, coaching, all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I think it's one of those, if you're in the UFC, you're not training harder than anybody else. Everybody trains hard in this sport, right? I think if you look at the true elite guys, what they have the ability to do is get back on the mats every single day. So the thing that differentiates the people at the top versus everybody else is their ability to truly train at the highest level from a technical, tactical perspective, day after day after day after day, for chronic periods of time, whereas everyone else might, reduce their training capabilities and then rebound a little bit. Still training hard, obviously, but I think that's one thing which we look to in our kind of conversations here as something that truly is differentiating the top guys, just their ability to go again and again and again on a daily basis or session to session, such that the technical input to their training and their skill development is that much greater than everybody else's.
Have you had a look at motivation from what you guys do?
We're getting into that a little bit, early days, if I'm honest. Yeah, and again, people are very motivated for different reasons to be fighters, right? So we all think that, the people that just want to, beat up other folk. But that's not always the case. Some people are using it as a very meditative type approach to what physical pain and trauma allows them to release themselves. Other people are coming at it because, they just love the martial arts and they're lifelong martial artists. Other people coming at it from, just financials, and I'm just providing money for my kids, right? So I think the motivation again is very, very complex, and we're starting to look into that, but we haven't got that. It's so diverse in the way people arrive at success in our sport.
Yeah, it's a question that I think a lot of other people want to have answered as well, let alone just UFC fighters. And it is interesting to think about the fact that a lot of different athletes can arrive in the same sport at the absolute elite of it, and yet be driven by completely different things. That you and me can both be fighting in the UFC, and you're doing it because you just love to scrap, and that's what you always did, and that's your passion, and I'm doing it because it's a meditative experience, and the next person that we're going to fight is doing it because he wants to provide for his family or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's another reason to be fascinated by our sport, like the diversity and the different variables that come into what makes, to define what a world champion is in mixed martial arts is like throwing mud at a wall and seeing what sticks, because you could have like truly world class athletes that are coming out of Olympic programs or whatever. You could have a guy that's just been around the streets, like knocking people out for a long time and has elevated to the top of small level promotions, through to kids today at 18 years old are training MMA from the get-go. So they're just that I'm a mixed martial artist rather than I'm a kickboxer or I'm a wrestler. That's kind of the cool part of it, is just the diversity and the complexity of people's backgrounds, and how do you say that this one route is any better than someone else's route to the top,
Have you got any idea? I think about this a lot to do with CrossFit because it's the sport that I'm most familiar with recently. But previously you had CrossFitters like Matt Fraser, most dominant CrossFitter basically ever. He came into the sport from weightlifting. So you have people that did analogous sports, transferred across, still had an unbelievable speciality within their original domain, but then broaden themselves out. And what you've identified here is that you have an equivalent with regards to MMA. Previously, people would have perhaps come from a very specialized background, be that wrestling or karate or boxing or Muay Thai. And now you're going to have people that are born and bred from the very, very beginning MMA fighters. Do you have any sense, or do you find it particularly interesting that, and then also have you got any sense around whether it is optimal to not specialize in one particular domain versus to become a generalist from the very beginning? Have you thought about this?
Well, I think if you look at the statistics of our sport, I think last time, this isn't an accurate number, so don't hold me to this, but last time I looked, we had about 87 different UFC champions in history, and something like 53 of them were from defined specialisms, right? Whether they are wrestlers or jiu-jitsu players or a kickboxer. Those numbers obviously changed now. It's kind of a couple of years since I saw those numbers. I just need to update those. But I think if you look at where the UFC has come from and look at it as a whole, then you can still say that there isn't a true generalist that's rising to the top. It's still a sport that is built on specialisms, and usually those specialisms are your X factor. So if we take Israel Adesanya right now, obviously he's much reported as the best striker ever in the UFC, right? He's a clear kickboxer. Glover Teixeira, obviously 40 years old, and he's got to the top to be a champion as a jiu-jitsu guy, right? So there's still people that you can say, well, that's a specialist. But I think if you compartmentalize, let's say, the last 3 years or the last 5 years of our sport, then you can start to see where, all right, that guy has come through purely an MMA training approach to success in our sport. Because again, it's become more popular as a sport. It's defined as an individual sport. It's not come from all the individual styles themselves. So people just train in MMA now. So I think, if you look at the history, it still leans towards specialisms. But if you look at more current day and you compartmentalize some of the more recent success, it's probably 50-50 is where the specialists are to where the generic fighters or generalists are.
One thing that's interesting, a difference between CrossFit and MMA that I've just thought of there. In CrossFit, your actual goal is to try and be just good at everything. The goal is to not lose any of the events. That's the way that you win. The way that you win is to be, top 5 to top 10 in every single different event. Whereas in MMA, the goal is to be acceptable across everything so that you don't have any weaknesses, and then to be able to peak within one particular domain that gives you an outsized ability to finish the fight, right? You're not going to win. You're going to be at more of a vulnerability if you are good at absolutely everything up against a fighter that's acceptable at everything and can push back most of your advances, but has one absolute freak dimension to their game.
Yeah, I mean, you can lose the Olympic Games in the decathlon by having a crappy javelin, right? And if you can't throw the javelin very far, you can be great at everything else. But that javelin is going to be the one reason why you lose a gold medal or even drop out of the medals. Same in our sport, right? If you can't compete off your back in jiu-jitsu and someone takes you to the ground, like game over. You have to have a level of generalism to be able to survive, right? Because the fight can go to anywhere. It can go against the fence. It can go to the ground. It can be stand up in the middle of octagon. You can be in the clinch. You can be, at distance, whatever. So, you have to have some awareness of all of those different types of things. But yes, clearly people have got to the UFC because they have an X factor, something that is like outstanding. Now, whether that is your takedown defense, whether it's your takedown offense, whether it's your striking, whether it's your grappling, whatever, there's something that is just getting you to the top, which you would need to maximize that potential. And that's an X factor, which becomes a competitive advantage. So philosophically, that's how we try and approach our programming, is that ultimately when you're off camp, when you're not in fight camp preparation, we tailor all of our energies and our efforts to minimizing your limitations, essentially to raising the lowest hanging fruit. Like what are the things that potentially will lose you the fight? When we move into fight camp, and now it's peaking, tapering, and optimizing your potential for success, we are sharpening the sword of your X factors. So we pursue a strengths kind of strategy. What are your strengths and what are your weaknesses, and when do we target those in the distribution of your training plan?
Dude, it's so fascinating to see a sport that didn't exist 30 years ago, 32 years ago, literally didn't exist, and now where you guys are taking it to is amazing.
Yeah, no, it's cool. It's cool to be around. Like I say, it's 30 years as a professional sport in 2023, so next year. And I still think, there's massive growth opportunities and learnings and professionalization of the sport, and it's taking it to the next level. That is, it's a great sport to be around right now. It's still growing and still improving.
If there's someone who has found the stuff that we're talking about here particularly interesting, what are some of your favorite resources to keep up to date with work that's in your region, that's in strength and conditioning, hypertrophy, like good accessible places that people can read?
Yeah, I mean, if there's any interest in MMA and the UFC, the UFC Performance Institute has released a digital journal which can be downloaded. There's a link for that on our Instagram pages and Twitter pages and things like that. Again, if you can't navigate that, just reach out through those channels and I'll let you know. But again, I think just looking at who are the players who's making movements in the world of strength and conditioning right now. There's some great people out there. Phil Daru's doing some good stuff. Obviously, Joe DeFranco has been doing it for a long time. Others, so it depends where you're coming from and what you're trying to achieve, whether it's MMA specific or whether it's more generic training.
Cheers, Duncan. Thank you so much for today, mate.
No worries. Thanks for the chat.
What's happening, people? Thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed that episode, then press here for a selection of the best clips from the podcast over the last few weeks. And don't forget to subscribe. Peace.